Inside a glass case in a small Danish museum lies a face so lifelike it once convinced police they had a fresh murder on their hands, and the same bog that preserved that face may have buried the real cause of his death for good. The peaceful sacrifice story sold to millions of visitors is wrong. Proof of that may already exist, and it isn't being shared. For 70 years, the museum that made him famous has told the world he chose his own death, willingly, for the good of his people. Ole Nielsen, the museum's own director, has now seen what a new scan reveals about how he actually died. He isn't saying yet. In April 2024, under near total secrecy, that scan happened at Aarhus University on the 2,400-year-old head of the man the world knows as Tollund Man. Rewind to May 1950. Two brothers, Viggo and Emil Højgaard, are cutting peat in the Bjelskovdal bog, 10 kilometers west of Silkeborg. When they see a face rising out of the black earth, the skin is dark, tanned like leather, but the features are intact. Closed eyes, stubble on the chin, an expression so calm and so fresh that the brothers assume they have stumbled onto a recent murder. They call the police. The Bjelskovdal bog in early May is not a dramatic place. Flat, brown, quiet, the kind of landscape most people would walk past without a second look. The Højgaard brothers had cut peat there before, season after season, without finding anything more unusual than roots and stone. That morning was different. What surfaced under the spade was not peat. It was a chin, then a nose, then two closed eyes, positioned as if the man underneath had simply lain down to rest a few thousand years too early. The police take one look at how deep the body is buried, over 2 meters down in undisturbed peat, and realize this is not a crime from last week. It is something from over 2,000 years ago. They call in an archaeologist instead, Professor P.V. Glob of Aarhus University, who will spend the rest of his career defending a theory about the man in the bog that the evidence never fully supported. News of the find spread fast. Local papers ran headlines suggesting a murder investigation was underway, and for a few tense hours, that is exactly what it looked like. Tollund Man was not the first face to rise out of a northern European bog. Peat cutters had been finding bodies like his for centuries, hundreds of them across Denmark, Germany, Ireland, and the Netherlands, going back as far as written records exist. Most were reburied without a second look, treated as unlucky drowning victims or forgotten farm hands. An unknown number were simply destroyed by the same peat-cutting tools that exposed them, gone before anyone with training ever saw them. Tollund Man was one of the rare ones who survived being found by people who understood what they were looking at. Because here is what almost everyone agrees on. The man in the bog was hanged. A braided leather rope was still knotted around his neck when he was found, trailing down his back pulled tight enough to leave a groove in the skin. He was in his 30s, well-fed, his last hours spent in relative comfort. He was buried naked except for a pointed sheepskin cap and a leather belt curled into a fetal position, as if sleeping, and the bog itself had done something almost impossible. It had preserved him so completely that decades later, museum visitors would still look at his face and feel like he might open his eyes. Forensic study later placed his height somewhere between 160 and 167 centimeters, wearing what would now be roughly a European-size 41 shoe, specific enough to feel less like an ancient myth and more like a neighbor who never came home. The reaction to seeing him in person was different from the reaction to seeing him in photographs. Visitors were not looking at a skeleton or a mummy wrapped in linen or bones behind glass. They were looking at a face, with stubble, with wrinkles, close enough to a living person that the same instinct which made the Højgaard brothers call the police in 1950 kept resurfacing decades later in ordinary museum visitors standing in front of the case. That face made him famous. Denmark built an entire museum wing around it. Poets wrote about it. Seamus Heaney gave him a poem that traveled further than most peer-reviewed papers ever will. Sculptors gave him a full body to go with his head, a careful reconstruction unveiled decades after his discovery. Tollund Man became Denmark's most recognizable ancient face, a national treasure with his own gift shop postcards and his own place in school textbooks. By 1952, he was ready for public display, and the museum built its identity around him. Visitor numbers climbed year after year. Guidebooks started calling him one of the most important archaeological discoveries in Danish history, and some writers reached for a bigger comparison, dubbing that calm, closed-eyed expression the Iron Age's answer to the Mona Lisa. It is not a modest label. For a face pulled out of a bog by two brothers cutting peat, it is remarkably close to the truth. Today he is kept in a dim, quiet room of his own, spotlit inside a circular case, deliberately set apart from the museum's louder exhibits so visitors slow down before they reach him. But that face is not entirely real. Only his head survived, along with one foot and a single thumb. Everything else you see in that museum case is a replica, built years later once conservators realized their original preservation method had failed and the rest of him had quietly decayed in storage. The man millions of people believe they are looking at is part corpse, part reconstruction, and that is only the first thing the official story leaves out. Look closer, because the crack only gets wider from here. To understand why his face survived and almost nothing else did, you have to understand what a raised bog actually is. It is not simply mud. It is a slow chemical trap. As sphagnum moss dies inside the bog, it releases a substance that binds up nitrogen and starves the bacteria that would normally break a body down. The water is freezing, acidic, and almost completely without oxygen. Together, those conditions tan human skin the way a tannery tans leather. That is why Tollund Man's face still has pores. It is why his eyelashes are intact. It is also why almost nothing about him can be genetically confirmed. The same acid that preserves skin, dissolves bone, and shreds DNA into pieces too small to read. Scientists have tried more than once to pull a usable genome out of his remains. Both attempts failed. The bog that gave the world his face took away any real chance of scientifically proving who he actually was. That failure stings more because of what has worked elsewhere. Otzi, the 5,000-year-old ice mummy found frozen in the Alps, has had his entire genome sequenced, down to his eye color, his lactose intolerance, and the geographic origin of his ancestors centuries before he was born. Ice preserves DNA. Bog acid destroys it. Tollund Man was found in far better physical condition than Otzi ever was. His face more intact, his features more recognizable, and yet genetically, he remains almost a complete blank. The very thing that makes him famous is the same thing that keeps him unknowable. So the world reached for the next best thing, a story. And the story Professor Glob told in his 1965 book on Denmark's bog bodies was not really built from forensic evidence. It was built from mythology. Glob pointed to a Danish artifact called the Gundestrup Cauldron, decorated with images of a goddess linked to fertility and renewal. That cauldron itself, like Tollund Man, had been deliberately placed in a bog rather than lost or simply buried in the ground. Evidence Glob took as proof that bogs across the region were treated as sacred space, not just convenient graves. He argued that men like Tollund Man were not punished. They were offered willing sacrifices, laid gently into the earth to guarantee the turning of the seasons. It was a beautiful theory. It was also, by his own evidence, unprovable. There is only one written account from anywhere near that period that even mentions bog burials, and it does not support Glob's version cleanly. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing more than 400 years after Tollund Man died, described two very different fates in Germanic territory. In one chapter, cowards and deserters were pressed under wicker hurdles into bogs, a punishment for men who had disgraced themselves. In another, he described a fertility goddess named Nerthus, whose attendants were ritually drowned once her rites were complete. Sacrifice and punishment, sitting two chapters apart in the same book, describing the same landscape. Tacitus called the punished men corpore infames, roughly translated as disgraced in body, men judged too shameful even for an honorable death. His description of Nerthus is stranger still. He wrote of a hidden goddess pulled through the countryside in a covered wagon, her presence so sacred that the slaves who washed her chariot afterward were drowned in a lake so that no living person could describe what they had seen. Two rituals, worlds apart in meaning, and Tacitus places both in the same stretch of forest and marsh, that historians now associate with the region where Tollund Man died. Modern archaeologists have never fully trusted Tacitus on this. He never set foot in Scandinavia. He was writing about outsiders, for a Roman audience, more than a century after the fact, with all the bias that implies. As one curator studying the bog bodies later put it, there are serious problems treating Tacitus as reliable evidence, and yet his account is still the closest thing to a contemporary written record anyone has. Strip it away, and the sacrifice theory rests on nothing but posture and mythology. Even now, decades after Glob's book made the fertility sacrifice idea famous worldwide, the archaeological consensus has shifted towards simple honesty. There is not enough evidence to say definitively whether Tollund Man died as an offering or as a punishment. That is not a satisfying answer for a museum trying to tell a compelling story. It is, however, the accurate one, and it is the one most current researchers are willing to defend in print. There are other loose threads. Isotope analysis, comparing chemical signatures in Tollund Man's hair to signatures in his thigh bone, hinted that he had moved at least 30 kilometers in his final 6 months alive. It is not proof of a long journey. The researcher who ran the test, Karen Margareta Frey of the National Museum of Denmark, has openly called the Tollund Man results thin, compared to what she has found in other bog bodies. But thin is not nothing. It means the story of a settled local man, killed and buried in his own backyard, is not as certain as the museum plaque makes it sound. Frey's work on other Danish bog bodies makes the uncertainty even harder to dismiss. Her isotope analysis of Holdremos woman, another well-known bog body, pointed toward textiles and origins that did not match a purely local life, suggesting she may have arrived in the region rather than been born into it. It has fed a wider theory among some researchers that at least some of these bog burials were not neighbors and locals at all, but outsiders, travelers, people who had married in or moved in from somewhere else. If that pattern holds, the tidy image of Tollund Man as a settled Danish farmer punished by his own community starts to look like an assumption dressed up as a fact. Graubel Man, another Danish bog body found less than 20 kilometers from where Tollund Man was pulled from the ground, adds another layer to the same uncertainty. His throat had been cut, not a rope around the neck, a different method entirely, found in a different bog, from a period roughly contemporary with Tollund Man's own death. Two men, similar age range, similar region, killed in two distinct ways. If this was one unified ritual tradition, it was not a simple or consistent one. And then there is a detail almost nobody outside Denmark knows. For decades, one of the original conservators who worked on Tollund Man's remains kept something for himself. The man's own big toe, taken during preservation and never returned to the collection. It stayed in private hands until after the conservator's death, when his children found it among his belongings and handed it back. A 2,400-year-old body, treated with academic reverence in public, quietly picked apart behind closed doors. By 1987, museum staff had built the full-body replica the public sees today, and in the process, they did something almost absurd. They took a fingerprint from his intact thumb and issued Tollund Man a Danish civil registration number, the same identification system used for living citizens. It sounds like a joke. It is not. Every time his remains are moved for testing, that paperwork is what makes it legally possible. The testing never really stopped. In 2018, a team reran the radiocarbon dating on his femur and a rib using a cleaner extraction method that filtered out contamination from the bog itself. The result locked his death down to somewhere between 405 and 380 BCE, the late Iron Age, more than 2,000 years before anyone alive today was born. That part of the story has never been seriously disputed. 3 years later, in 2021, researchers went further than anyone had before and analyzed exactly what was still sitting inside his gut. The results, published in the journal Antiquity, read almost like a coroner's report. 12 to 24 hours before he died, Tollund Man ate a porridge of barley, flax, and knotweed, most likely with a small amount of fish mixed in. Inside that same gut, researchers found the eggs of 3 separate parasites: whipworm, mawworm, and tapeworm. It was the first time a tapeworm had ever been confirmed in a bog body. Evidence of undercooked meat or contaminated water working through his system for years before his death. That level of detail was only possible because researchers at Museum Silkeborg finally applied modern forensic biochemistry to material that had been sitting preserved since 1950, extracting steroid markers and lipid ratios sensitive enough to tell plant intake from animal intake with real precision. 70 years after his discovery, his own gut was still giving up new information. Nobody in 1950 had the tools to read. This wasn't the quiet, dignified last meal of a chosen man. It was the diet of somebody who lived rough, ate badly, and carried parasites for years. And that complicates the sacrifice story instead of confirming it. If he was a special offering, why does his final meal look like the diet of an ordinary, chronically infected farmer? There was one more detail buried in that same study. Threshing waste, the kind of low-grade grain debris a farmer would normally discard, was mixed into the porridge. Researchers noted it might point to ritual practice. It might also just mean he ate badly in the days before he died. Nobody can say for certain which. There is a seasonal clue buried in that same data. His stomach held no trace of late summer or autumn fruit, the kind of thing an Iron Age farmer would have had ready access to for months of the year. That absence points toward a death in late winter or early spring, which lines up, conveniently or not, with the timing many fertility rituals across ancient Europe were built around. One theory suggests the timing itself was the point, that he was killed specifically at the hinge between seasons to help guarantee the harvest to come. It is suggestive, it is not proof. A man can die of natural causes in early spring just as easily as he can die as part of a ritual calendar. What everyone actually wanted was his genome, and that is exactly what the bog would not give up. Ancient DNA specialists targeted his femur, the same bone used for the radiocarbon work, hoping enough genetic material had survived to sequence. It had not. The DNA was there, technically, but broken into pieces, too small to carry any usable information, the biological equivalent of a shredded document. Specialists have said publicly that they are not giving up. Next time, they want to try the petrous bone, the dense structure at the base of the skull that tends to protect DNA far better than any other part of the body. There is just one problem. Getting to it means drilling into the same skull that holds his famous, publicly beloved face. The petrous bone is not a random target. It is the densest bone in the human body, built to protect the delicate structures of the inner ear, and that density happens to shield DNA from exactly the kind of chemical damage a bog inflicts on everything else. Researchers working on other ancient remains have pulled usable genomes out of petrous bone samples that failed everywhere else in the skeleton. For Tollund Man, it is the last realistic chance at a genetic answer. It is also, quite literally, hidden behind the face that made him famous in the first place. Ancient DNA extraction has improved dramatically over the last decade, recovering usable genomes from remains once considered hopeless. That progress is exactly why specialists keep returning to Tollund Man instead of writing him off for good. The 2024 scan was not the first time modern imaging had been pointed at Tollund Man. Back in 2015, his feet were sent to a museum laboratory in Paris for a micro-CT scan of their own, checking the blood vessels and even looking for something as mundane as skin warts. It sounds almost comically small next to a full head scan 9 years later, but it mattered. Each pass of new technology across his remains adds one more layer of data to a case file that has been open for 7 decades without ever fully closing. Which brings us back to that van in the dark. On April 22, 2024, Tollund Man's head left Museum Silkeborg for the Department of Forensic Medicine at Aarhus University, where it spent 24 hours inside a piece of equipment called a Tescon Core Tom, a micro-CT scanner powerful enough to see structures no previous scan had ever picked up. There is something almost pointed about the choice of department. Forensic medicine at Aarhus University normally examines the recently dead, victims of accidents, homicides, and unexplained deaths from the last few years, not the last few millennia. For one day in April, The same equipment used to investigate modern crime scenes was aimed at a killing that happened before Rome had even conquered Gaul. According to Ole Nielsen, the museum's director, the resolution in the new images came out 422 times higher than the scan performed back in 2002. He compared it to getting a new pair of glasses. The scan itself took an entire day inside a windowless room at the university's forensic medicine department, technicians and conservators working in shifts around a head that has not left Danish soil in 74 years. It was not treated like an artifact on loan. It was treated the way a hospital treats a patient, wheeled in, positioned carefully, monitored the whole time by people who understood exactly how much history was resting on that table. What that new pair of glasses showed was startling on its own. His right eye turned out to be almost fully intact, lens and optic nerve included. The left had been punctured at some point, but the brain behind both eyes, though shrunken after 2,000 years, was still recognizably a brain. For the first time, researchers could see his teeth clearly, without prying open what staff have nicknamed his Mona Lisa mouth, the same faint, ambiguous, almost smile that made him famous in the first place. The scan also let researchers examine the fine structure of his tooth enamel for stress lines, faint growth interruptions that can reveal childhood illness or malnutrition decades before death, a level of detail no scan before 2024 had ever been sharp enough to capture. The stated purpose of that scan was simple: settle once and for all whether the rope around his neck killed him by hanging or by strangulation, two mechanisms that leave subtly different marks on the vertebrae and soft tissue. Marks a scan 400 times sharper than before might finally be able to separate cleanly. According to the university, that conclusion has already been reached. They have not released it. The official reason is standard scientific process. Results are held back until they clear peer review and formal publication, the same procedure any serious lab would follow. That is probably true. It is also true that an institution sitting on the actual, physical answer to a 74-year-old mystery and choosing silence over disclosure is its own kind of tension. Somewhere in Denmark right now, a group of researchers already knows exactly how Tollund Man died. The public does not. While that answer sits locked away, it is worth remembering how badly identity science can go wrong when nobody double-checks the old story. In Germany, a bog body known as Wendy Wayne was assumed for over 50 years to be a teenage girl, executed alongside her lover as punishment for infidelity, blindfolded, half her head shaved, a story dramatic enough to end up in textbooks. Then, in 2007, a researcher named Heather Gill Robinson ran a genetic test on the remains. The chromosomes came back male. Wendy was a teenage boy, roughly 16 years old. The supposed lover buried nearby, it turned out, had actually died 300 years earlier. The blindfold was probably just decayed fabric. The shaved head was probably just decay too. An entire tragic romance, invented from a body that was never a girl in the first place. Denmark has its own version of that story, and it is even more embarrassing. In 1835, another bog body was discovered at Haraldskær and identified, almost immediately, as Queen Gunhild, a 10th century Viking royal figure known from legend. The Danish king at the time was so convinced that he had her buried in an actual royal coffin inside a church with her name carved into the stone. For over a century, tourists paid their respects to a Viking queen. Then, in 1977, radiocarbon dating on her remains came back. She had died around 490 BCE, roughly 1,500 years before Queen Gunhild was ever born. An entire national myth, built on nothing but resemblance and wishful thinking, dismantled by a single lab result. It is not an isolated embarrassment either. Denmark's own oldest bog remains, a set of roughly 10,000-year-old bones known as Tollund Man, were assumed to belong to a woman for decades, based on skeletal features alone. A genetic test in 2016 quietly overturned that too. Tollund Man was, in fact, a man. 3 separate cases, 3 confident identities, 3 reversals, all inside a single country's collection of ancient remains. This wasn't just an old case getting quietly corrected. It was proof that Denmark's own bog bodies had been getting misread, sometimes for generations, without anyone noticing until the science finally caught up. Every time modern testing gets a real shot at a bog body's identity, the old confident story tends to fall apart, which is exactly why Tollund Man's silence is so unnerving. He might be the one case where the tools that keep proving everyone else wrong simply cannot reach him. He is not even the only body from that specific patch of ground. In 1938, more than a decade before Tollund Man surfaced, workers found another body in the same bog, less than 100 meters from where his face would later emerge. She is known as Elling Woman, also hanged, a leather cord still around her neck, her hair braided with unusual care. Radiocarbon dating puts her death roughly a century apart from his. 2 people, hanged the same way, buried within walking distance of each other, a century apart, in the same small patch of Danish peat. That is not one strange death. That is a pattern, repeated deliberately, over generations, for reasons nobody alive can fully explain. Across Northern Europe, researchers estimate that well over 1,000 bog bodies have been recorded since the 17th century, and that number almost certainly understates how many were actually found. For most of that history, nobody preserved them properly. Farmers reburied them out of superstition. Peat companies destroyed them by accident. Entire identities, entire causes of death, gone before science had the tools to ask a single question. Tollund Man and Elling Woman survived that pattern by pure timing, found just as archaeology was learning how to listen to what a body like theirs could actually say. And when the science does work on a bog body, it makes Tollund Man's case even harder to sit with. In 2024, researchers studying another Danish bog body, known as Tollund Man, successfully combined DNA analysis with isotope testing and found something remarkable. He was not a local at all. Genetically, he was a foreigner, likely originating far to the north, someone who had traveled a long way before his skull was smashed by 8 separate blows. The tools worked. The evidence was there. The bog cooperated. It is proof that this kind of certainty is possible, just not so far, for the man whose face made this entire field famous. Ireland has its own version of the same argument. Old Crogan Man and Clonycavan Man, 2 disputed bog bodies with theories tying their deaths to kingship rituals and territorial boundaries, show the same sacrifice versus punishment debate playing out far beyond Denmark's borders. Over 7 decades, dozens of researchers across archaeology, forensic medicine, and genetics have taken their own turn at Tollund Man's case, each one adding a new layer of data without ever fully closing the file. So the museum sits with an uncomfortable choice. The one test that could actually answer who Tollund Man was genetically requires drilling into the same skull that draws in visitors by the thousands every year. Damage the face and you risk damaging the very thing that makes him worth studying in the public's eyes. Leave the face intact and the identity stays exactly as unresolved as it has been since 1950. There is no institution here twirling a mustache. There is a museum, a university, and a piece of history caught between preservation and proof, each with a legitimate reason for choosing caution. Museum staff have spoken openly about that tension. The head draws visitors from across the world specifically because it looks so undeniably human. Turn it into a research specimen with a drill mark in the skull, and something about that draw might quietly disappear, even if the science gained from it would be extraordinary. It is not a decision anyone at Museum Silkeborg has to make quickly, but it is a decision that gets harder to avoid every time a new imaging technology makes the payoff look a little more tempting. There is a bigger question sitting underneath all of this, one that goes beyond a single skull in a single Danish city. Bog bodies across Northern Europe have become national symbols, treated less like archaeological data and more like ancestors, mascots, tourist economies. Denmark's identity is genuinely tied up in that calm, closed-eyed face on the postcards. Every time a new test threatens to complicate the comfortable version of that story, it is not just a scientific question on the table. It is a piece of how an entire country tells its own history to itself, and to the millions of visitors who show up expecting the version everyone already knows. Somewhere in Aarhus right now, that scan result is still sitting in a file, waiting on publication. Somewhere in Silkeborg, a 2,400-year-old face is still behind glass, still wearing an expression that has been called peaceful for 70 years without anyone actually able to prove it was chosen rather than forced on him. The rope is still real. The bog is still real. The parasites, the last meal, the failed genome, the isotope hints of a short final journey, all of it real, all of it carefully collected, none of it quite enough to finish the story. Tollund Man was not a myth, and he was not a hoax. That was never the real question. The question was always whether the story told about him was built from evidence or from something closer to hope. And after 74 years, a scan 400 times sharper than anything that came before it, and a result nobody outside one Danish university has been allowed to hear, that question is still open. And Bjælskofdal itself has not been fully explored. Peat cutting in that specific bog stopped decades ago, but archaeologists have never ruled out that more bodies, or more direct evidence about the ones already found, could still be sitting undisturbed a few meters down. Every bog body ever pulled from Danish soil was found by accident, by farmers and peat cutters who were not looking for history. Nobody knows what is still down there waiting for the next person cutting fuel for a fire to notice a face where there should only be earth. Somewhere between a Danish peat bog, a 19th century church coffin built for the wrong queen, a stolen toe returned by a dead man's children, and a scan sitting unpublished on a university server, the story of Tollund Man stopped being simple a long time ago. What is left is a face the world has trusted for 70 years, and a body of evidence that has never quite caught up to that trust. The next time you look at that calm, sleeping face behind the glass in Silkeborg, remember that somewhere else in Denmark, a folder already holds the answer to how he actually died. It simply has not been opened to the public yet. If you want to be there the moment it is, that is exactly why this channel exists. So hit subscribe and stay close. Because when Aarhus finally publishes what that scan revealed, it may force Denmark to rewrite the story of its most famous face. And here is the real question, worth sitting with until then. If the tools that keep proving other certain identities wrong finally reach Tollund Man too, are we ready to lose the peaceful story we have told about him for 70 years?